February 9th, 1942. Normandie Pier, Manhattan. 2:37 p.m. The largest, most luxurious passenger ship in the world was burning out of control in New York Harbor. The SS Normandie, converted into a troop transport for American soldiers, was engulfed in flames that could be seen from Brooklyn. Thousands of tons of military equipment were destroyed. Hundreds of workers were injured. And somewhere in the smoke and chaos, Nazi saboteurs were celebrating their first major victory on American soil. 3 hours later, Commander Charles Haffenden of the U.S. Navy walked into the most unlikely place imaginable to ask for help defending America, Dannemora State Prison in upstate New York. He was there to meet with Lucky Luciano, the most powerful crime boss in American history, who was serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for running a prostitution empire. America was losing World War II on the waterfront, and the only man who could save the docks was locked in a maximum security prison cell. But to understand how Lucky Luciano became America's most unlikely patriot, you need to understand what was happening on the docks in early 1942. Nazi Germany had unleashed Operation Drumbeat, a submarine campaign designed to destroy American shipping and cripple the war effort before it could reach Europe. German U-boats were sinking American ships faster than they could be built. In January and February 1942, Nazi submarines sank over 70 vessels off the American coast. Merchant sailors were dying by the thousands. Military equipment was disappearing into the Atlantic Ocean. And worst of all, Nazi saboteurs were operating freely on American docks, gathering intelligence, recruiting collaborators, and planning attacks like the Normandy disaster. The U.S. Navy was desperate. Traditional security measures weren't working. Naval intelligence couldn't penetrate the tight-knit communities of dock workers who might be harboring enemy agents. Federal investigators didn't understand the complex social networks that controlled waterfront operations. But Lucky Luciano did. For 20 years, Lucky had controlled dock operations throughout New York Harbor. Not through official positions, but through the loyalty of longshoremen, the cooperation of union leaders, and the respect of everyone who made their living moving cargo through the port. If Nazi agents were operating on the docks, Lucky's people would know about it. The problem was that Lucky was in prison, serving time for crimes that seemed insignificant compared to the Nazi threat to American national security. Commander Haffenden faced an impossible choice: follow regulations and watch America lose the war on the waterfront, or make a deal with the devil and give the Navy a chance to win. Haffenden chose pragmatism over principle. "Mr. Luciano," Haffenden said during their first meeting in March 1942, "I'm going to be direct with you. America is losing this war because Nazi agents are operating freely on our docks. You know those docks better than anyone. We need your help." Lucky studied the naval officer with the calculating gaze that had made him the most feared man in organized crime. What kind of help? Intelligence, cooperation from dock workers, security arrangements that actually work. The Navy can't penetrate waterfront communities the way your organization can. Lucky leaned back in his chair. "And what do I get in exchange?" "We'll discuss that after you prove you can deliver results." Lucky smiled. He was being asked to save the country that had imprisoned him. The irony wasn't lost on him. But Lucky understood something that many prisoners didn't. Sometimes cooperation is the most effective form of resistance. Within 2 weeks of Lucky's agreement to help, the security situation on New York docks was transformed. Dock workers who had been suspicious and uncooperative with naval investigators suddenly became eager to report suspicious activities. Union leaders who had stonewalled federal agents began providing detailed intelligence about potential security threats. Most importantly, Lucky's network began identifying and eliminating Nazi sympathizers who had been operating undetected for months. Not through violence, but through economic pressure, social isolation, and information warfare that made enemy agents ineffective and unwelcome. The results were immediate and dramatic. German submarines found it increasingly difficult to gather intelligence about ship movements. Nazi saboteurs discovered that their dock contacts had disappeared or become unreliable. Enemy agents who had been planning attacks found themselves under constant surveillance by people they couldn't identify or avoid. By June 1942, Nazi submarine attacks on ships leaving New York Harbor had dropped by over 80%. The Normandy disaster was not repeated. American troops and equipment began flowing to Europe without the catastrophic losses that had characterized the early months of the war. Lucky had accomplished something that the entire U.S. Navy hadn't been able to achieve. He'd made the New York waterfront secure for American operations. But Lucky wasn't finished. He convinced his contacts in Sicily to provide intelligence about German operations in the Mediterranean. Sicilian fishermen reported submarine movements. Sicilian dock workers sabotaged German supply ships. Even Sicilian crime families began conducting operations against Nazi forces occupying the island. Operation Underworld expanded from New York Harbor to the entire Mediterranean theater. Lucky Luciano, sitting in a prison cell in upstate New York, was coordinating anti-Nazi activities across 2 continents. The cooperation was so effective that the U.S. Navy began planning the invasion of Sicily with intelligence provided directly by Lucky's criminal contacts. When American forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were met by Italian resistance fighters who had been organized and equipped through Lucky's network. But the alliance between America and Lucky Luciano came with a price that troubled everyone involved. The U.S. government was legitimizing organized crime in exchange for national security benefits. Naval officers were taking meetings with murderers and racketeers. Federal agents were working with criminals they had spent years trying to arrest. Most troubling of all, Lucky's cooperation was making him more powerful, not less. By helping the U.S. government, Lucky was strengthening his position within organized crime and building relationships with federal agencies that would benefit him long after the war ended. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who had sent Lucky to prison, was particularly concerned about the implications of Operation Underworld. "We're making a deal with the devil," Dewey warned. "Lucky Luciano is using patriotism as a cover for expanding his criminal empire." But Commander Haffenden argued that the benefits outweighed the risks. Lucky Luciano has done more to protect American shipping than the entire Atlantic Fleet. If that makes him powerful, it also makes him useful. The debate over Operation Underworld reflected a larger question about American values during wartime. How much cooperation with criminals was acceptable in order to defeat fascism? Could democratic principles be temporarily suspended in service of democratic survival? Lucky understood the moral complexity of his situation better than anyone. He was simultaneously a patriot and a criminal, a defender of American interests and a threat to American justice. The war had created an opportunity for redemption, but redemption that came at the cost of legitimizing the criminal system he had created. In 1945, as World War II ended, the U.S. government faced a difficult decision about Lucky's future. His cooperation had been invaluable to the war effort. His criminal organization had proven more effective at protecting American interests than traditional law enforcement agencies. But Lucky was still a convicted criminal serving time for serious crimes. The solution was deportation. In February 1946, Lucky's sentence was commuted in recognition of his wartime service. But instead of being released into American society, he was deported to Italy, where he would spend the rest of his life in exile. Lucky accepted deportation as the price of his cooperation. He had saved America's waterfront, protected countless American lives, and contributed to Allied victory in World War II. But he would never again set foot on American soil. Operation Underworld remained classified for decades after the war ended. The U.S. government was embarrassed by its cooperation with organized crime and reluctant to acknowledge that criminals had played a crucial role in defending American security. But military historians eventually recognized Lucky's contribution as one of the most effective intelligence operations of World War II. Lucky Luciano proved something that challenged conventional thinking about crime, patriotism, and national loyalty. Criminals could be patriots. Enemies of society could defend society when the stakes were high enough. Evil men could do good things when properly motivated. The operation also proved something troubling about democratic societies during wartime. When faced with existential threats, even democracies will compromise their principles, work with their enemies, and legitimize behavior they normally condemn. Lucky spent his final years in exile, living in Naples, Italy, and maintaining loose contact with his American criminal organization. He died of a heart attack in 1962, still banned from the country he had helped save 20 years earlier. But Operation Underworld left a lasting legacy in both law enforcement and national security circles. The cooperation between government agencies and criminal organizations became a template for intelligence operations that continues to this day. The lesson was simple. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend, even if that friend is a criminal. Lucky Luciano had committed terrible crimes. He had corrupted police officers, exploited vulnerable women, and built an empire based on violence and intimidation. But when America needed him most, he had chosen patriotism over self-interest, cooperation over resistance, and national security over personal grievance. The man who had been America's most wanted criminal became America's most unlikely hero. Operation Underworld proved that, even in the criminal underworld, love of country could triumph over love of self. If this story of unlikely patriotism and wartime cooperation moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you believe that redemption is possible even for the worst criminals. Share this with someone who knows that sometimes good and evil are more complicated than we want to admit. What would you have done in the government's position? Let me know in the comments below.